Welcome to the Customer First Thinking Podcast, Episode 15. My name is Stephen Shaw, the host of this podcast. In this episode, we interview Mark Penn, the CEO of MDC Partners. With so many brands slashing their marketing budgets these days, the global agency holding companies have been taking a financial beating. But the pandemic is not solely to blame. It's just worsened a pre-existing condition. The business woes of the agency holding companies initially began years ago, when digital ads began to overtake TV as the preferred ad medium. Heavily reliant on traditional ad spending, agencies were slow to respond to the growing client demand for data-driven strategy and digital transformation. And then the big consulting companies swooped in with their change management playbooks, wooing away global clients by leveraging their C-suite relationships. Meanwhile, agencies were under pressure from clients to lower fees, forcing them to reduce billings and trim staff. They were caught in a deadly embrace, expected to deliver the same level of service at a lower cost, torpedoing their profit margins. Today, clients are more desperate than ever for design thinking, marketing innovation, and technical wizardry. But where do they turn? The complexity of managing marketing communications across multiple touchpoints has become overwhelming. Brands need help orchestrating the end-to-end customer experience. That calls for agencies to undergo a radical transformation of their own, fixing a broken business model by helping clients catch up to the growing expectations of their customers. Mark Penn, the CEO of MDC Partners, the ninth largest agency holding company in the world, recognizes the urgency of transforming his $1.5 billion enterprise into a, quote, modern marketing company of choice. Last year, he made a calculated bet that MDC could respond more nimbly to the needs of clients than its much larger competitors, buying into the company with a $100 million investment from his private equity firm, the Stagwell Group. He took over the company at a critical time, its stock price in need of rescuing. Now, after a year of fixing the balance sheet, Mark Penn has set out to reinvent the company's service model, knowing that clients are looking for answers to their business challenges beyond advertising. The partner firms, as MDC likes to call its family of 50 agencies, have been clustered into synergistic hubs, or what they call tent-pole networks, making it easier for their leaders to collaborate and pitch new business together. The goal? Offer the right balance of strategic thinking, versatility, and creativity. While the pandemic may have put a crimp in his plans, Mark Penn is renowned for turning emerging trends into opportunities. He earned fame as Bill Clinton's pollster for 6 years, helping him win re-election in 1996, partly by convincing him that he needed to win over a new swing voter called the soccer mom. He went on to serve as chief strategist to Hillary Clinton in her 2008 campaign to win the Democratic presidential nomination. He's also been a senior advisor to such well-known leaders as Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer, Tony Blair, and the late Menachem Begin. A decade ago, Mark Penn published a groundbreaking work called Microtrends, which posited that opportunity can be found by identifying small slivers of the population who have a disproportionate influence on social, cultural, and political trends. His latest book, Microtrends Squared, builds on that original work, describing a new set of forces at play shaping the direction of society. So, I started the interview by quizzing him on his thesis.
The basic notion of a microtrend was always kind of the small forces that are in many ways right in front of yourself that you maybe don't see, that are developing into super important trends. And so we classically used to define a microtrend as a percent or more, that it had to be growing, right? That it had to be a little bit counterintuitive, like I don't do a microtrend, like people are concerned about the environment. Then we also look for every trend, what we call Newton's law of trends, for every trend there is a counter trend, just not necessarily opposite and equal. Will be opposite, but not necessarily equal, right? And so you always have to look at both ends of the spectrum. If you're looking at, that everybody's getting a smartphone, so that's the trend. That's maybe a mega trend, right? But a micro trend is people buying more flip phones, for example. So there's a group of people who say, I can't stand this technology. I don't like it. It's too complicated. It's not for me. And then it turns out that you have you might call it a niche, but it's a growing segment of people who want to be, against technology, who very much want to have a different technological experience, right? And so they bring back the flip phone. So that's kind of, if you look at this, you really kind of expect to see growth. You expect it to be small, but punch over its weight, right, in order to be something of significance, and that it could be something, significant, even if it doesn't get to be a mega trend like buying a smartphone.
How do these niches make themselves apparent to you? Are you gleaning this from survey work that's been done? Is this the power of observation, simply seeing these forces at work and you're identifying these trends? And the quantification of the size of the segment you referenced and whether it's growing or not. How did these evolve in your work?
Well, I think part of the book is also to teach people to be what we call a micro trender, meaning how do you identify some of those trends in front of you that could be significant. Look, the original book was the number one book in advertising for quite some time.
Yes.
So there was a real interest in advertisers and finding groups because I had been at the root of creating Soccer Moms. It was really the Soccer Mom creation that, okay, here's something that's happening, but it's not really crystallized. And
right.
So part of what you do with finding a microtrend, first you kind of put forward, and what you do in all research is you put forward a hypothesis, right? And then you look at the studies around the hypothesis. Maybe you do some yourselves and you say, the hypothesis is true or false. Like, I had a hypothesis that, parents were more at work so that they were kind of stricter with their kids, right? And that hypothesis turned out to be false. It was the other way around. Yeah. Because they were away from work, they were softer, right? Because they felt bad about being away all that time. And so the actual impact was the opposite of what I expected. And so you do, it takes a leap of creativity combined with data, combined with validating. But the important part of a microtrend is then understanding the implications of the trend across all potential areas. So you take something like single with pet. One of my favorites, and obviously one that the last few years had a huge implication for marketing. The pets were generally bought by families, by kids who demanded them, right? And so they lived with two people, often two adults and 3 kids, and so they got scraps, right? Now, instead, a lot of people particularly people who said, I'm not going to have a child for another 10 years, but my apartment's a little lonely, why not get a pet, right? And so a huge number of people now bought, and 50% of millennials bought pets of one kind or another during this phase of their life. But those pets are the only person, right, in their household, and so they kind of love, attention, food, etc. that they get is just enormous, right? And then if you're building housing, and you're building housing in urban areas for cities, and you thought you were going to have a no pet policy, well, you've got to change the policy. And then if you're selling dog food, you realize that kind of customer is going to spend more money and demand things like GMO-free pet food that some household that's serving them scraps is not going to demand. Right. So you've got to find a trend that everybody isn't at, because everybody's at the trend of Well, we had earlier in first microtrends 10 years ago, I had pet parents. Those were older couples after the kids had left buying pets because they didn't like the house being so quiet and taking on that responsibility. And so they also had the attribute of enormous disposable income because they had been paying for all these kids and now they were out of the house. And so that was truly the pampered cat or pooch, right? So in any event, there's a lot of implications and a lot of the other microtrends too are serious. They'll have they'll hear, kids on meds, and it'll have enormous policy implications as well. So they range the gamut that way. But it is an exercise where we want to teach you to be a microtrender, and we want you to understand the significance of things that seem trivial and insignificant, and yet they can have enormous impacts either for your clients if you're in marketing, or for what has to be done in terms of policy and how society might change, right?
How it might function. Yeah, there's a big sociological set of implications to these niches, and by their nature, they're somewhat ephemeral, if I may say that. That is, as society evolves, new niches spring into being or evolve out of potentially other segments. So it's a very dynamic way to look at an evolving market, as opposed to traditional classical marketing, which looks at things in a very static way. Is that fair to say? Make that distinction between this segmentation?
I don't think they rise and fall overnight. The reason that there were 10 years between the two books is it really takes about 10 years to kind of have a new slate. And even that I revisited maybe 4 or 5, something like Internet Marrieds, right? So Internet Marrieds, when I wrote the first book, that was just the beginning of that trend. It was a micro trend. And of course, no one would admit, like, where did you meet your significant other? They didn't say, on the internet at the so-and-so site. Nobody said that. They made up something else, right? But then you fast forward 10 years and the stigma is largely gone. So they say, we of course met on X.com, and they're quite open about it. But at that time, if I go back 10 years, I thought that micro trend would result in a tremendous mixing of the classes, that now people could broaden their social sets. They wouldn't just kind of marry people at work or in a small search closer set or a friend of a friend, that now they could marry anyone from anywhere, and that would create so much of a social mixing. And of course, as internet marriage got so big, the opposite really happened. That people said, I can now be in the Ivy League group. Right. So they actually segmented themselves. And so a lot of the things in Microtrends Squared, I'm able to look at and say, did it turn out the way I was hoping? And oftentimes, unfortunately, the answer is no.
Right. And the other thing that struck me is, and it's so true, is that you make the case that society today is at this crossroads, being pulled in opposite directions. For every trend, there's a countervailing force. And I think you used the term chaos, but discord certainly in society. Given the current riven state of society, how do you see this playing out over time? Is there a likelihood to things simply get worse? Do you see a return to a time where there is some at least level of unifying social consensus? Or are we past the point of no return around all of this? What are your thoughts on this? Certainly has political implications.
Again, in Microtrends 1, I was hugely optimistic, right? That basically what was happening is we were moving from what I called the Ford economy. You could have any color of product you wanted as long as it was black, right? To the Starbucks economy, right? Which was 55 different varieties of something that is black coffee, right? And so the concept was that personalization now became the driving force of marketing and product manufacturing. The Apple iPod was the first time every person could easily have a custom track, right? And a lot of the work then, if you look at the iPod, you did the work by and large. At Starbucks, the barista did the work in order to customize it, to what you wanted. So then we now are in the Uber economy, right? Which is an infinite number of choices, right? The product can be made exactly to you. Uber will take you from any point to any point instantly. So in effect, they're creating an infinite number of variations in the product. And so I was hugely optimistic about this. So then I fast forward, and then it turns out that after a while, people go to Starbucks and they say, just give me the regular. Right. So in fact, people then, just like I suggested with internet marriage, they then move the other direction. They get comfortable in the choices that they like, and they don't experiment much anymore. And so the paradox of choice is the more choices I give you over time, the fewer choices you make. I always use this analogy of a restaurant that just serves chicken or fish, right? You don't care all that much. Chicken, fish, right? Now I add steak and sushi, right? And then some group gravitates over to steak every day, and some group gravitates over to sushi every day. And then they get really dug in their choices, right? And then, you know what happens next? Then the steak people say, you know, that sushi could kill you. There's lots of bacteria, right? And the sushi people start to say that steak, it's just heart disease, right? And then you think, oh, Fox News and MSNBC, right? So then the world of choice here has then, people then have found their niches, then they get stuck in their niches. And so rather than bringing society all together, right, the better the economy, the better that we can niche things in terms of, you know, whether it's politics or socially or you know, products, we're actually balkanizing society more than I expected, and that is having some more negative impact than maybe I thought was going to be the case 10 years ago.
Are we past the point of no return around that? Do we simply become a society that's increasingly more fragmented, increasingly more divided, increasingly balkanized, to use your term?
Well, you know, not necessarily, but it takes leadership to really change courses like that. If you look at it realistically, there is a schism between two rather big groups, what I call the old economy voters and the Silicon Valley or the new economy voters, right? And so those who are lifted by the growth of the new economy fundamentally have a different sense of values, a lifestyle, attitudes towards international affairs, right, than those in the old economy. And so the theory was the old economy voters were shrinking. And what happened is they wound up with so small a share of the GDP relative to their numbers that they rebelled and said, you know what? We got as many people here as these new economy voters, and it's a democracy, and we're going to reassert our rights here, right? Mm-hmm. And so we're going to reassert what we, you know, and come down on the trade that's costing us jobs. Now, leadership evolved that then crystallized a lot of those sentiments that had been sitting there. Will leadership come along and really be able to crystallize the desire for society to operate on a more cooperative and collaborative basis? So far, no, right? So far, several presidencies have run on that basis, but they didn't achieve it, right? By the end of their presidency, Bush ran as a uniter versus a divider. Obama ran hope and change. Trump didn't run that way. He ran basically, I'm for the old economy voter here, right? And I'm going to push back on. So that was a kind of a different way of running. But I don't know that the result is any different than the end of the Bush administration or the end of the Obama administration, right? They all wound up at the same kind of more divided place because a lot of these forces then are pulling the two parties apart, and it will take someone who really says it and means it to bring society together. And I also think it's important for products and marketers to think more about that.
I was going to ask you that question because, you know, you certainly see today more than ever brands thinking about what their purpose should be, thinking about, you know, should they take a stand on certain issues or not. There's always a risk, of course, associated with that in alienating a certain part of your customer population, which holds this set of values versus another set of values. How do marketers reconcile that when they're trying to appeal, in fact, to the values of their customers?
Well, I mean, oftentimes they don't do a very good job of it at all, and they help promote in the name of trying to show more corporate awareness and purpose. They wind up promoting more division, right? And, you know, look, some customer bases, you look at your customer base and you can safely take, you know, a particular position and it will reinforce it, right? Or you look at a customer, you know, I always remind people, you know, whatever Ford Motor Company is going to do, their number one product is the F-150. Right. And the F-150 is a very different customer than someone who's going to be buying a suburban sedan kind of customer. And so people have different customer bases, but I do think that the marketers have to think more that what seems like an easy win can also, at the end of the day, fracture their consumer base.
Right.
And I think that's that's more of a danger, and that they have to pick carefully those things that can unify us. If everyone picks a side, and if everyone picks a side, based on their customer base and which side is right, then society itself will just get more divided.
It's an interesting challenge for marketers for sure. I think Nike, Ben and Jerry's, Patagonia, there's a long list of companies that have lined up on one side and basically are making statements to society. Nike probably being the most outstanding example of branding courage, if I may call that, by making these quite bold stands and really setting an example. Is there an expectation now that people have of brands that they look to them for leadership on some of these issues, or not?
Well, generally, there are a lot of polls out there that ask questions like, do you think your company that you buy things from should, stand for, social improvement and justice, right? Now, who's going to say no to that question?
Right.
Again, you can be very successful at doing that, or you could fracture your consumer base if you have a different kind of product in a different market. And remember, at the end of the day, the consumers are buying products that they expect to work. And what you do in the political and social realm can't be used to cover up an inferior product.
Right, of course.
Right? Yeah. And so I do think that people can get carried away with the trend of social marketing. Some will be more successful than others. We know that, like one of the razor companies, tried something that backfired essentially, right? So you can see examples of success in Nike. You can see examples where it backfires. But remember, the essence of what people rely upon or trust, and I think it's been very interesting during the pandemic, you look at the companies who rose up in the minds of people. They were the Amazons, the Walmarts, the FedExes. They were the people who proved, you know what? We're in a huge crisis, and these companies are delivering for me. Right? And the fact that they were able to deliver for them under these adverse conditions, right, in the grocery stores, right, people really appreciated that. And they really, frankly, they have a better view of healthcare, and we're on a technology platform now. They have a stronger view of technology companies. Technology didn't roll over and collapse just because everybody now went on it. Quite the opposite. It worked, right? And so people's trust in companies to deliver for them immeasurably improved through this process. And I don't think companies should lose sight of how important that is.
Of course. And just on the subject of a pandemic, I mean, clearly it's having a major impact on people's attitudes, on their spending, et cetera. All kinds of speculation now in terms of the aftermath and what the likely permanent effects of this pandemic will be on people's attitudes. Typically, we know in past pandemics and major crises, there's always been an indelible imprint left by those events. So do you see microtrends squared 2 coming out very soon in terms of the microtrends that will emerge from this current health crisis?
Well, I do think it'll be interesting to see how things kind of come out of the crisis and what changes. I generally explain that there are some companies now getting more business than they ever had. A lot of household products, milk and orange juice, things that are associated with, improving your immune system, right? And there's a lot of companies that just went down with the economy, and some things, again, that people kind of stopped doing to the same extent that they were doing, and dressing up and clothes and all of those things. And then there are things that got associated directly with the pandemic, going to the movie theaters, going on a cruise, going on a plane, right? And the solution for each of these, like if I'm orange juice, I want to keep my new customers and say it was good in the pandemic. I've got to continue to hold on to them after it. And then for a lot of customers who got out of the habits that they used when they saw other people and traveled to other people, I've got to bring all those back, right? And remember how good they were and how they make people feel. And I think that's going to be a very big job for marketing. and for a lot of companies to kind of look at. There are a few new tech things like, ordering groceries, things that people didn't, that actually were there and worked, but people didn't use because they didn't believe they worked. I think ordering groceries on apps like Instacart's really kind of fascinating because they didn't change for it. And Zoom was also here, but nobody, but nobody used it, right? These things were already developed, but they couldn't find the marketplaces. And there are some of the examples of companies that will have a much strengthened consumer base. And then what is it going to take to get people back on airplanes, right? I think you're beginning to see consumers go back on airplanes to some extent, to see family, to take a vacation they just can't wait on. And I think right now you're seeing business travel at close to zero, right? And almost no business travel coming up. So that's going to be interesting to see what happens to business travel, post-pandemic. I always use as much video conferencing as possible, as much as anybody will accept it. What's great is people will accept more of it, than they ever did in the past. So I think there's a lot of it's coming out. And then I also have to say that looking at it by the generations or the personality types is really kind of fascinating. The younger generation, relatively speaking, had no war, no draft. You had the 2009 financial crisis, but most of them really didn't understand it at the age that they were at. And so this, in many ways, was the first actual crisis that they were part of. 9/11 was too early for them also. They weren't here for that. And when you look at it, the levels of fear among younger people are as high, if not higher, than the levels of fear among older people, despite it being a disease that primarily affects older people.
Well, it's interesting observation. I mean, you have a whole generation that's coming along thinking now that they can't do as well as their parents. And it must have an impact on the way they spend. They think about saving. They think about everything, really, in many respects, don't they?
Well, actually, when you look at the crosstabs of polling on that question, it is the older generation that thinks their kids cannot do as well as they did. When you actually poll the younger generation, they say, of course I'm going to do better than those old fogies. And they have a very positive image of how they are going to do. And a lot of that is fueled by the fact that they see themselves living in a world of technology wonder that didn't exist for their parents and the older generation.
Right. And certainly there's the grand promise of the fourth industrial revolution changing everything in a number of years. I do want to move on to this subject of technology because it's such a driver, clearly, as we've been talking about through this whole conversation. And, I don't want to overemphasize this. My takeaway from your book is that you don't quite view it as a liberating force. And certainly today there's lots of concern around the triopoly. Are they friend or foe? What's your perspective on this, and particularly social media, given the things we were talking about earlier, these countervailing forces are amplified, obviously, by social media. What's your prescription for moving forward on this? A lot of people are sort of thinking in the sense of stricter regulation. Other people thinking that these big technology companies should be broken up. What's your feeling about where we are today with technology, and particularly these three big companies, Amazon, obviously Google, Apple, and so on?
Well, let me see that I'm a particular technology enthusiast, I would say. Have been ever since building my first computer in a kit. And of course, obviously was chief strategy officer at Microsoft. So right. I got to really see, where technology was going and how it's going. So I'm a huge believer in how it will transform life for good. Having said that, there are certain aspects here that really are going the wrong way and that we're going to have to think about. Just as, when I was working for the president, we were looking at Hollywood and he said, look, we need to come to some agreement here with Hollywood because there were no rating systems and you didn't know what content was appropriate for what kinds of people. And now you're going into whole areas of fact-checking and censorship and violence, online, and the tools being used to organize things. And so we're going to need some standards. And I think classically the movie industry at that time, the ratings avoided regulation. I think the tech companies really should come up with some uniform standards with proper third-party appeals processes here, because there's right now, if I do a poll, I think it's about 40% of people think that liberals are being censored on the internet, and about 60% think that conservatives are being censored. Yeah. But my point is that everybody thinks they are being censored. Right. Okay, and so you can't have in the long run, a system that is the most open system ever created, and have everyone believe that there's this kind of censorship going on, without, I think, setting some industry-related standards. And I think the fact that each company tries to do it shows you how we need to have something where it's more uniform and where people have real expectations of what can and cannot be published, and a real right to appeal to something other than a bot. Mm-hmm. And these bots are, as a hobby, I have a political game, and I advertise the game, and all the time now it's flagged as political advertising. Really? And I say it's not political advertising. It's you play a game about politics, and then I get nowhere with the bots, right? So because the bots can't. So the fact that you have these authorities that can't distinguish, right? That they can maybe hit the right thing 80% of the time, and 20% will automatically censor things that probably shouldn't be censored and regulated. This is a problem that has to be dealt with. And then something I hit in microtrends a lot is what I call relationships with a bot, right? So you have to be very careful as you trust technology more and more to do things for you, and to do things for you, with a bot that answers and creates a relationship with you, and that is deliberately designed, right, to have your trust and confidence. And who are they working for? How do they pick their algorithms? What's their real interest? I used to use the example of, you ask the bot, what's the weather like before you go to work? And then it says, the weather is, it's going to rain. And then somebody at the company with the bot, realizes that we're helping all these people, and we're not getting any money for it. So they make an agreement with the umbrella company. And so now they say, how's the weather going? You say, it's going to rain today. And by the way, you can buy an umbrella on your way to work down the block, right? And they get a VIG on the umbrella. Perfectly fine, no problem. Then somebody says, earnings are really weak. Can you get some more money out of this umbrella thing? So then they go back to their algorithm and say, right now we have that tune to tell people it's going to rain when it's 60% going to rain. Let's just move it to 40, right? And we'll get people more worried about rain, and they'll buy more umbrellas, right? And you didn't know that what you thought was working for you is actually there to sell you umbrellas. You don't see how the algorithms are working and what they're tuned for, and how companies are responding to their financial requirements. So all of that is a hidden process that we're going to need, I think, real disclosure on.
Yeah, transparency, totally. Yeah. So I'm going to take our conversation a different direction, because clearly, given your position as head of MDC, I want to talk in the remainder of our time here about the state of the ad industry. I know that you have very strong feelings, about the industry, and obviously the role of the holding company, which, as we all know, that model has been under siege in recent years. Declining valuations, revenues declining, etc. Just a synopsis of what you think the major factors have been that have contributed to the decline of these holding companies, and how do you see the current model being reinvented as we go forward here?
Well, I think a lot of the issues are the classic issues that you see in any industry where there's innovation and disruption, right? First, you had big players who were formed many years ago, who then were slow to understand the changes that were underway, and it's typically very hard because you've got all of these investments, and they're all invested in what the last technology was and is, and it continues to work on them. And they also got too big, right? They got so big that then, in order to adapt to the new technology, it required things that would be virtually impossible to do easily and quickly. And so marketing itself, I think, became, went from kind of this mass marketing, primarily of brand, right now to a much more performance-oriented mix of marketing, digitally fueled. We're flipping the switch over, whereas most money is spent online. When I ran the $2 billion budget at Microsoft, which wasn't that long ago, 5 or 6 years ago, the digital budget would have been almost a small portion or an afterthought of the principal campaign. Today, it has to be the campaign and integrated in every aspect of it, and performance marketing is an integral part. Loyalty and CRM is an integral part, and the three offline marketing has to work together. So as I always easily express it, I say today you have to get the right ad to the right person at the right time, right? And this is after procurement spent a long time moving creativity apart from media, right? And apart from research sciences and data and information. And now if you're going to do the best job that you can, you're going to have to bring those things together, right? And so at MDC, right, I think MDC was less encumbered with what I'd call fully traditional media. Obviously, its size and scope was much smaller and more manageable. And I created Stagwell, with the idea of having a digital first holding company in the digital age. And, we're talking about a merger, but even without the merger, we're still working cooperatively together. And I'm, of course, CEO or managing partner of both. And together, we have kind of top flight creativity that is almost impossible to find in the holding companies, working on an entrepreneurial basis, right, because of our size and the incentives that we've put in place. And we have growing digital offerings, both within MDC and at Stagwell, that together, I think, are really the components of the modern marketing machine that you really need to put together today to service clients. And I think as we build this and we grow this, we will have an alternative model, right, built on global hubs that will enable us to compete for larger and larger accounts against the bloated holding companies that almost by necessity are just slower and more difficult to adapt to this disruption. As I often say, they were a disaster before the disaster, right? And in some ways, the disaster maybe helped them, clean house faster than they're going. But I was obviously at one of the big holding companies before I went to Microsoft, and my principal observations were they didn't manage talent and value high level talent in the way that you needed to, and they weren't making the transition over to digital and technology and its integration that are really the hallmark of modern marketing.
So part of the challenge, I would think, is given the disarray the media world is in today, ad spending dropping off a cliff. You referenced digital ad spending, but that's gobbled up by just three companies now. Are we, just with respect to advertising, which is such an important revenue source for most agencies still today, are we at this inflection point now? What is, just speculate for me if you don't mind, what the ad world looks like 3 years from now?
Well, I'm not as pessimistic about budgets as you are. I think at the end of the day, they're down single, digits. I think that they're down double digits. I think we'll see where it ends up, but on offline media and kind of traditional stuff, I think you see a lot of growth, a lot of movement to e-commerce and online transactions and online platforms. And then I think you see kind of the growth of addressable media across. I think when television becomes more and more addressable, and then all of the other ways of viewing content are addressable, you really have a data-oriented marketing world to a much greater extent. You used to have to buy a sport or a show with the hopes of hitting certain types of people. To me, part of the issue is with a market with so few actual suppliers, are advertisers getting enough of the benefit of the new world of technological targeting that should be fundamentally cheaper than old-style marketing? I'm not sure that it's any cheaper. I think it may even be as if not more expensive to reach people, even though the cost of reaching them should should have
Well,
dramatically
there's a lot of
plummeted.
waste baked into the process right now, right? Which is, been the complaint of the big packaged goods companies. The dollar isn't working as hard for them as it could be, for sure.
But I think if you think ahead, I do think mass events and tentpoles continue to be important. I think the world's best digital ads have yet to be invented or created. I think whereas some of the world's best, on-air ads, I think you'll find at the MDC agencies. I think that the craft of how you really impact people who are, on a non-interruptive basis, unless you're just, running it on pre-roll. I think that still hasn't been fully cracked, so that a lot more of the marketing online is going to be more performance, or basically click-based, rather than being able to provide the kind of, brand image and storytelling and that you really still can do best on TV. So I think that you're seeing the digital media expand, though. We're looking for a recovery of the Olympics. I mean, this year you have the election. I always tell people we used to spend a lot more money on marketing a single hamburger than we did on the elections, but now that's been reversed, and there's probably $5 billion being spent in the election. But that really goes, I think, to firms that are in the election space. I think when you get the recovery of professional sports and the Olympics, I think you'll see some significant uptick. So I think that the marketing world continues to become more complex. And I think the more complex it is, the more it requires experts who sort it out and figure out the best ways to reach customers and the best format and creative format to do them. So I'm not as pessimistic about how modern agencies can advance to service customers. I think that marketing itself becomes just far more complex. And that means that it's really hard for in-house operations, to really do the same kinds of things that agencies do because of, I think, the talent gap.
Most businesses are faced with, and really, I think, understood dramatically with this pandemic, the need for digital transformation. And many companies are way behind in terms of their customer expectations versus what they can deliver. There's this experience gap, I call it. However, to your point about complexity, are agencies today positioned to deliver the answers? I mean, you have the big consultancies moving into their turf over the last number of years, in fact, buying up creative services, as we know, taking advantage of their C-suite relationships, leading with the concept often of transformation. How do agencies respond to that? I'm going to express it as a threat. How do agencies respond in kind? Can they service the C-suite as effectively, as credibly as the big consultancies? What's the requirement for change here with agencies to compete effectively?
Well, I think what we're trying to do when you look at it and you look across Stagwell with Code and Theory, the kind of company that has hundreds of designers and hundreds of engineers, right? So they can design it and they can build it, and you can rely upon it. And the same thing over at MDC with Instrument, same kind of talent that you have, and YML, even more advanced in terms of technology. We have a group of about 100 engineers generally to build, and we're soon releasing tech SaaS products for clients on our own. I think that agencies have to combine data, technology, and creativity, right, in effective ways. And we're lining up the resources to do that. I think if you're sitting there with a consultancy and you've got a big digital transformation practice, you're trying to graft some creativity on it. And I think that certainly has sold to some customers. But I kind of think that if is it digital or technology first, or is it creativity first, right? I do think it's got to be a very strong combination of both of those. And the consultancies at the end of the day are overweighted on digital transformation. And we were underweighted on that. And I think we continue to build up our weight.
Then to build up weight, as you put it, what will that require?
Yeah, I think when you look at the resources we have with the Harris poll and NRG, millions of consumer interviews being done, and those consumer interviews then go into a large data pool along with behavioral and other kinds of data, so that these kinds of micro-trended niches that really make a big difference in terms of marketing can be found on the base. So you need a data platform on that, and we have, uniquely the millions of Harris interviews as inputs to that platform. You need a technology stack on top of that. You need people who are great in the three disciplines, I think, of CRM and understanding current customers, of performance marketing and understanding future customers and how you bring them in online, and then how you manage your offline media and position your brand. And I think we're putting together really and have today those services that we continue to build together in terms of a more seamless application. And then you really have to bring them together with the creative agencies. Right. When I was and you've been here for some time, at MDC, everybody was on their own. And that's not the case anymore. Today a 72 and instrument are going to be, lockstep going to clients and being able to offer offline, online creativity, digital construction, right, all together at once in ways that was never the case before.
Right. I mean, the key words certainly will be agility and collaboration for sure. But it also calls for, given the complexity you've been describing, the rise of a generation really of T-shaped people. People who are comfortable and conversant with the technologies, but have the sort of the social intuition that Mark Penn has to bring to observations of both customer behavior and market behavior, for that matter.
And that's interesting in the sense that strategy and kind of human analysis, people thought, we're just going to have the consumers do everything. There's a box over here. I always say that the cost of data and the value of data keeps dropping to zero because there's just more and more of it. And the value of analysis keeps rising to infinity because you face more and more difficult problems. And it turns out it takes people at the end of the day to really set the framework, right, of the strategy. And that's why I think some of our companies like Anomaly is a very tight integration, right, between strategy and execution. And that is really a huge place. And some of the other agencies are then, I think, following suit to expand that combination.
It's interesting because there's been so much conversation about the future of marketing. And, I always make the point that the two most important skill sets that a true marketer can have is empathy and curiosity. And those two in combination allow us to bring unique value to companies. But what I also see is that marketers have diminished in stature in most businesses. They've been relegated to being the pretty picture department. How can marketing, not speaking specifically now about agencies, but marketing itself, we've seen the CMO title disappearing, being eliminated by certain brands, being replaced by chief growth officer, in some cases chief experience officer. How does marketing reclaim its place at the strategy table in businesses today? How do they bring and particularly coming out of this pandemic, emerging from the crater that's been created, the economic crater that's been created, how does marketing help lead the way to recovery and, I would argue, renewal in many respects? Reinvention, if I may use that term again. How does marketing take a leadership role going forward?
It's a good point because I think for the last few years, as marketing has undergone transformation, so then the question has been, what kind of person has the right skills to be CMO, right? Is it someone who's more data-oriented? Is it someone who's more a professional manager? Is it someone who's steeped in the creative community? Is it someone who really understands brand positioning? And the truth is, you almost need to be a chef of all, trade in all these trades, right? And you really need to understand pretty well each one of those to be a successful CMO. And I think that so the nature of the job became more complex, and so I think there was confusion. I think it'll settle down over time here because the big wave of disruption is over, and people are now figuring out how do you put the pieces together. And I think, look, marketers and marketing has to answer fundamental business challenges, right? It has to create opportunities that are not going to happen by themselves, without whether or not it's finding the soccer mom market, or whether it's finding kind of a new generation of professionals out there. It has to, in understandable terms, create and move forward opportunities for companies that meet their fundamental challenges. And there should be no C-suite in which the CMO or the CMO title equivalent is not part of it, because especially coming out of the pandemic, the consumers are so now, I think, volatile and able to kind of permanently switch off products they used to use, or permanently adopt products that they've just started to adopt, or pull back and go back to their old habits, that marketers have a bigger role than ever to play. And I think they have to get out there. You always have to get out ahead of the CEO and lay out the questions that the company is facing, right? Before the CEO does. And then I think you really look to as offering tremendous value.
Well, the answer clearly isn't just an ad anymore. And there's also discussion that, brands going forward have to be, and I'm going to use this term loosely, humanized. Is the role of the marketer to be also the conscience of organizations, to say, guys, we need to do the right thing by the customer, which is the concept of customer first thinking. We need to do the right thing by society, which is this whole question of conscious capitalism. We've heard lots of debate and conversation about that over the last couple of years, in fact. Is marketers' role here to really be the conscience of businesses?
Well, I think that's one of their roles. I also think the CCO has a very large role to play in that. I think to the extent the structure, the CMO was never really trained typically in all of the kind of complex policy issues, right, that the CCO generally was pretty comfortable with. And so those efforts, and particularly around sustainability, generally were driven. There's some merger, there's some argument that sometimes those two positions in the right company can be one, or that they have to be more closely knit. I think that if they're the conscience of the company as opposed to the central driver of revenue and sales and success for everybody, right? Is your CFO looking at you and saying, God, I just can't wait to cut that unnecessary budget that we're just wasting.
They still think that today.
And that's for, right? Or if you maintain, it's like, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, cut that budget, and you'll see sales fall in half, and you'll see that the new product never really gets launched, and that you're not making progress. That
isn't that interesting? I mean, but isn't that the conundrum still all these years? And I've been in marketing a long time, as you can tell. Is that they could never really demonstrate that return on investment to the CFO, and hence that budget stays at 12% of revenues and is cut in bad times. That's never changed, even today.
Yeah, I would say that's by and large true, but hopefully we'll develop, I think, more tools that can trace ROI more effectively, because now we can trace the whole loop from surge to action to purchase. I think there's never been more data to prove the effectiveness of marketing than during the pandemic, when people were by and large not going anywhere, shopping online, and you could follow the complete track of where they went. So I'm generally optimistic about the future of modern marketing. Again, more companies will become more global, and they will extend, I think, some of the marketing techniques that maybe are pioneered in a lot of the developed and tech-heavy countries, and then kind of spread those, I think, increasingly throughout the world. So there is transformation, but as I always show in charts, you saw offline media going down, you saw news and print, collapsing, you saw radio going down, you saw digital billboards going up, you saw search, social, online shopping, all of those things taking off, growing 20% plus a year. That is where marketing is. That's where it's going to grow. And that's where I think, MDC is being brought along to play heavily in that space as marketing develops.
Mark, this hour has absolutely flown by. I could talk to you for 2 more hours. It has been absolutely fascinating conversation with you. And I, again, want to express my deep appreciation for the time you've taken here today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It was terrific.
That concludes our interview with Mark Penn. As we learned, for marketers to reclaim their rightful place at the strategy table, they need to get out ahead of the CEO, spotting micro trends that might otherwise go unnoticed. But that means paying attention to smaller segments of the population who punch above their weight, along with anticipating the domino effect on market demand. Agencies also have a bigger role to play, serving as subject matter experts with the creative intuition to be a matchmaker. Out of the ashes of this pandemic will emerge a new form of marketing, less reliant on ads as a tactical crutch. You can find past episodes of this podcast on customerfirstthinking.ca, where you'll also find articles, strategic frameworks, video, and more on the transformation marketing. In closing, a big shout out to Justin Eacock for his contribution to making this podcast happen. Until next time, thanks for listening.